In July 1944, as the final brutal acts of World War II played out across Europe and the Pacific, delegates from 44 nations gathered in a serene setting far removed from the conflict. They met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the financial system of the future. The stated goal was noble: to build an international order grounded in cooperation, stability, and peace. They aimed to prevent the currency chaos and beggar-thy-neighbor policies that had fueled the Great Depression and contributed to global conflict. The result of that conference, the Bretton Woods Agreement, established the US dollar as the anchor of the world economy. Currencies everywhere would be fixed to the dollar. The dollar itself was fixed to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. The world accepted this because the United States held 2/3 of the world's gold, and its industrial base was untouched and unparalleled. It sounded like discipline. It sounded like trust. But beneath the veneer of global cooperation, a financial coup was underway. The United States was not simply building a system to save the world. It was engineering a blueprint for its own global financial empire, ensuring that the entire planet would remain dependent on American currency and American policy. This is the story of that deception. It is the story of how America leveraged a global crisis to achieve a dominance that armies could not win, and how the system that promised stability was fundamentally flawed, designed to enrich the issuer while pushing the cost of global governance onto the world. The price for global order was the silent surrender of economic sovereignty. The Bretton Woods system granted the United States an extraordinary unchecked advantage known as the Exorbitant Privilege. Because the dollar was pegged to gold and acted as the global reserve currency, every nation needed dollars to conduct international trade, settle debts, and hold as financial reserves. Other countries had to earn these dollars through exports and hard work. America, however, could essentially print its own currency to pay for imports and finance its global ambitions. The U.S. exported paper, the world exported real goods and labor. But this system contained a structural, self-destructive contradiction, a flaw identified in the early 1960s by economist Robert Triffin. To function as the world's growing economy demanded ever-increasing liquidity, the U.S. Treasury was required to continuously supply vast amounts of dollars to the global system. The only realistic way to inject this volume of currency was by running constant budget deficits and trade deficits. This created Triffin's Paradox. In the short term, running deficits was necessary for global growth. In the long term, running deficits meant the U.S. was printing far more dollars than it possessed gold to redeem them at the promised $35 an ounce. The foundation of the system, the promise of gold convertibility, was actively undermined by the very necessity of maintaining global dollar dominance. By the late 1960s, this imperial overreach exposed the fraud. Washington was financing the enormously costly Vietnam War, expanding domestic spending programs known as the Great Society, and maintaining an expensive network of overseas military bases. Instead of raising politically unpopular taxes or imposing austerity, the easiest path was chosen: printing more dollars. This flooded the world with U.S. currency, weakening the promise of convertibility. Foreign governments, particularly those observing closely, began to worry. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, openly distrusted the dollar, famously calling it an unfair privilege. De Gaulle took the symbolic and real step of sending French naval vessels to New York City to redeem French dollar reserves for physical gold from Fort Knox. The gold started flowing out, confirming that the mathematics of the Bretton Woods system did not add up. A global run on America's gold reserves had begun, threatening the entire structure. The crisis reached its peak in the summer of 1971. Inflation was rising domestically, the gold reserves were draining alarmingly, and the world was calling America's financial bluff. President Nixon faced a choice: either impose deep austerity, slash spending, and raise taxes to restore fiscal discipline and save the dollar's link to gold, or sever the link entirely and embrace a new, untested monetary reality. On a quiet Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, Nixon went on national television and announced the decision that shocked the world. the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That temporary measure became permanent. The Nixon Shock officially killed the Bretton Woods system and completed the quiet transfer of financial power. Overnight, the dollar, and consequently every major world currency tied to it, was untethered from any tangible asset or scarcity constraint. Money stopped being a promise of gold and became pure fiat, currency backed only by the decree of the government and the collective faith of the people. This was the moment money truly stopped being real. The consequences for global finance were profound, even if invisible to the average citizen initially. First, the discipline of gold was gone. Governments and central banks were free to print money at will to finance wars, bailouts, and deficits, limited only by the resulting inflation and the loss of trust. Second, debt exploded. Since most money in the fiat system is created when banks issue loans, the expansion of the money supply became inextricably linked to the expansion of debt. Money became debt, and debt became limitless. Third, inflation was fundamentally baked into the system. The lack of an anchor meant that money's value was guaranteed to erode over time. Since 1971, the dollar has lost over 85% of its purchasing power, a silent, slow-motion theft of savings that continues today. The old stability was replaced by an illusion of stability maintained by perpetual debt and centralized printing power. To maintain the dollar's global necessity after severing the gold link, Washington urgently needed a new anchor. They found it in the one commodity every nation needed: oil. In the early 1970s, U.S. officials, notably Henry Kissinger, struck a critical, secret deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter and the de facto leader of OPEC. The terms were brutally effective and brilliant in their simplicity. First, Saudi Arabia and all OPEC members would price their oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars. No matter where a nation sat, if they needed oil to run their factories, power their cities, or transport their goods, they had to acquire U.S. dollars first. Second, the United States promised comprehensive military protection, arms sales, and political backing to the House of Saud, ensuring the regime's stability. Third, the massive dollar surpluses resulting from oil sales, petrodollars, would be recycled back into U.S. financial markets, primarily by purchasing U.S. Treasury bonds and depositing funds in Wall Street banks. The petrodollar system was the indispensable second phase of the Bretton Woods deception. It effectively replaced the gold standard with an energy standard. Every nation was forced into holding U.S. dollars, ensuring perpetual, automatic global demand for U.S. currency and, crucially, U.S. debt. This recycling loop allowed the U.S. to continue running massive deficits, financing its consumption and military without the normal risk of currency collapse, because the world's need for energy guaranteed buyers for its bonds. The U.S. could export inflation. The world paid the cost. The structure established at Bretton Woods also gave birth to two powerful global institutions: the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. These organizations were presented as tools for global recovery and stability, but they quickly evolved into financial enforcers for the new dollar order. The petrodollar recycling loop, fueled by massive oil profits, created enormous liquidity in Western banks. These banks aggressively loaned dollars to developing nations across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, eager to industrialize or fund internal programs. The trap was set. These dollar-denominated loans tied the fate of dozens of sovereign nations directly to the monetary policy decisions made in Washington, D.C. The crisis hit in the early 1980s. When the U.S. Federal Reserve dramatically raised interest rates to fight inflation at home, these loans became instantly unpayable for debtor nations. Mexico's near default in 1982 triggered a chain reaction, plunging Latin America into a massive debt crisis. The IMF intervened with rescue packages, but these lifelines came attached to devastating structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. These austerity mandates were dictated from Washington and imposed severe conditions on struggling countries: massive public spending cuts, the privatization of state assets, devaluation of local currencies, and wage freezes. The result was the lost decade for Latin America. Economic stagnation, soaring unemployment, and intense social unrest gripped the continent. The IMF's policies ensured that Western creditor banks were repaid in full, while the local populations absorbed the pain of economic collapse. Debt became a tool of relentless political control, allowing financial power to erode national sovereignty without the need for a single invading army. The financial system was preserved by sacrificing the populace. The Bretton Woods deception, solidified by the Nixon Shock and the Petrodollar deal, created the permanent debt addiction that defines every modern economy. The entire global system is now fundamentally dependent on the endless expansion of credit. The mechanism of money creation ensures this dependency. In the fiat system, most money is created when banks issue loans. If borrowing stops, the money supply shrinks, jobs disappear, and the economy collapses. Modern economies function like a shark. They must keep swimming or borrowing, or they die. This is why central banks panic when credit slows. This dependency is supported by the quiet mechanisms of debt monetization and inflation. Debt monetization, the bond trick. To finance the current U.S. national debt, now exceeding $34 trillion, the government issues treasury bonds. When traditional buyers hesitate, the Federal Reserve steps in, creating new money digitally to purchase these bonds. This self-financing loop keeps rates low and deficits manageable, but it fuels the expansion of the money supply. Inflation, the silent tax. Inflation is not an accident, it is policy. It silently erodes the dollar's value. This wealth transfer, known as the Cantillon effect, ensures that the new money flows first to asset owners, inflating stocks, real estate, and financial assets. By the time that inflation trickles down to ordinary wages, the value has already been stripped away. Inflation is the hidden tax that allows governments to pay off old debts with cheaper currency. Bretton Woods successfully replaced a system based on tangible gold with an elaborate, global system based entirely on trust in American debt and military dominance. Today, the scale of global debt is unprecedented, exceeding $300 trillion. This mounting debt mountain guarantees that the system remains fragile. The final lesson of Bretton Woods is that money is never neutral. It is a weapon, a form of control, and a set of rules written by the powerful. America successfully engineered a system where its financial prosperity was paramount. Yet, by building this empire on infinite credit and the illusion of eternal demand, it tied its own destiny to a mountain of debt that history shows must eventually be inflated away or forcefully reset. The question is no longer if the financial empire will face a reckoning, but whether citizens will recognize the pattern of deception before the final cost comes due.